Let's dig in, Ben. Paul Finebaum potentially running for U.S. Senate. In doing some digging on this, found out that his move back to Alabama was fairly recent, and that would be the state that he would, of course, be running in. So that is a tea leaf that, of course, you can read. And in an interview with Clay Travis, Finebaum said that the Charlie Kirk murder was kind of potentially a big domino for him. He would run as a Republican in Alabama. And this is part of a growing trend, I think, that I kind of want to get to, both just with people like this running for office suddenly, but also just kind of a collision between sports media and politics that you and I have been waiting to finally happen in 2025. And I think we're in the middle of it now. But before we get to those kind of branches here, just what did you think of Finebaum announcing this and the idea of him running in general?
I think he's doing it. That's like my my reaction is like, I don't think this is bluster. I don't think this is going to be like a Stephen A. Smith for president type of flirtation. Like, I think he's going to do it. I think if you read this interview with Clay Travis and just kind of put some pieces together, especially this coming just days after Bruce Pearl announced that he wouldn't be running for Senate in Alabama. Like, I think it's pretty easy to piece this together as something that was done strategically if he were to run. Like it was done to kind of informally launch a campaign. And so I find that part of it interesting. I find another part of it interesting is like, we now know what Paul Finebaum's politics are. And that was, I mean, you probably could have guessed at some, especially a comment he made about Zoran back in a couple of weeks ago. But I think that it's like, it's just interesting for somebody who's kind of works at this place that it's not really political, but a lot of times his job does intersect with the space between culture and politics and sports. We now know, like, yeah, he is firmly a Republican. He's a Donald Trump supporting Republican. And he said the one thing that could like really ensure that he does run is if Donald Trump asked him to do so. So I find all of it very interesting. And I also think he's going to do it.
Yeah, I agree. It's, not like, this wasn't a interview where all of a sudden it came up and he did the Stephen A. Smith of, well, I would never say no. This felt orchestrated. This felt purposeful. He's talking about the qualifying deadline. He's talking about Bruce Pearl, like you mentioned, not running. He said he talked to somebody to clear that part of it up. Like, yeah, this is not a tease or a maybe. This feels like, what do they call it when you're dating and you
hard launch
on Instagram for the first time? Yeah, exactly. That's what this was. So yeah, but when you say like Finebaum's politics, I think that's kind of a fascinating part of this, and something that I think the right-wing media has latched onto. The quote about how ESPN tells him not to talk about the fact that he had voted for Donald Trump. And like, I do think that there's levels to how you kind of handle yourself. And I think that might tell us a little something about what it'll be like if Finebaum actually runs here, right? Like, yeah, ESPN tells everybody. I don't think anybody's ever talked about who they actually voted for on ESPN. Like, that's just not really a thing. I don't read too much into that. It's called being an employee that doesn't want to get fired, in my opinion. I don't think it was you're only not allowed to talk about it because you're Donald Trump, or because it was Donald Trump. But I do wonder, like, how this will play out, given that he's been so reserved in the past. Like, what does a Paul Finebaum political candidacy even look like to you?
I think he's pretty measured. Like, I think he actually, that's always been kind of my perception of Paul Finebaum, is that he's measured and he lets kind of the antics of his callers drive the conversation. It's very reminiscent of a lot of, political talk show hosts, the way he handles himself, and everything kind of comes off very matter of fact and very common sense like, and then that can drive his detractors even more crazy. I mean, I don't know, because he hasn't been a super political person. And so it's interesting, not only like the strategic part of it, not only what he said, but where he said it, the fact that he went to Clay Travis, the fact that he went to Outkick and as an ESPN employee, and that's where he's doing this. And so, I mean, I do think there are certain aspects to the conservative movement and to the right you do have to embrace to be a successful candidate in 2025. But I don't like the idea that he would be like a hard right, like very, very pro Donald Trump, MAGA type of candidate. That would just kind of, I don't know if he will or won't, but it would seem to be out of his character from what he has portrayed throughout his however many decades now as a sports media personality.
Yeah, that's kind of how I received it too. To me, I mean, this is a man who's 70, grew up and has lived most of his life in the South, and seems to have conservative, just kind of personal beliefs and values, but is broadly well liked in a very liberal media space. Doesn't really seem to be confrontational or get into conflict with anyone. No one seems to have a bad thing to say about him, really, that has worked with him. He's not really the type to be outspoken. Yeah, political is one thing, but even just to kind of like cast aspersions on athletes he's covering, or there's all these ways that media people can kind of tell you a little bit about themselves if they have any sort of personal value that conflicts with anything going on. It's never even been that. So that just runs counter to a lot of how we see people run these days. You know what I mean? Like he's taking over the seat from Tommy Tuberville, and like I not that Tommy Tuberville was the most successful politician ever, and it is Alabama. The primary is kind of the general election. Like I'm not trying to be a political expert here, but it's not the typical kind of guy from a outside of politics space being driven to get involved. Usually, like out here in Arizona, Jay Feely is running, right? And he was an analyst for CBS Sports. And for him, it's a lot more of the adopting the Trumpian, rhetoric and the types of topics and talking points and culture wars that seem to be energizing a lot of newly engaged political people. It seems like the exact opposite with Paul Finebaum. Like he seems to just kind of genuinely be approaching it, and I don't know if that works anymore. I don't know if a 70-year-old guy who just kind of like is concerned for the country. It feels like a story from 15, 20 years ago if you didn't have the words Donald Trump involved.
I mean, to tie it to Paul Finebaum's career, to tie it to sports, to tie it to stories we've written about within the last month or so, like Paul Finebaum's big thing this summer, right, was that he went out on a limb and was proclaiming Arch Manning the greatest college quarterback since Tim Tebow, before Arch Manning had, really played a true game as a starting quarterback at Texas. And obviously that was quickly disproven. Like Arch Manning has gotten off to a pretty subpar start here in this first month of the college football season. And Paul Finebaum's just been laughing at himself and making fun of the take. And like, that is not something you would do in politics in 2025. Like, I don't know what the equivalent of that take would be, but you would just keep doubling down and blaming the other side and blaming circumstances that were out of your control. Like Paul Finebaum he's never like taken himself too seriously. Like he's kind of in on the joke, and that's something I don't know if that translates to politics in 2025. It's going to be interesting to watch how this character evolves, because you do kind of have to play a character in both realms.
There's a lot of people on every type of politician these days that you would call like unapologetic. Paul Finebaum is apologetic, right? Like he's almost, he plays it too evenly. And I think that's why he's liked by his listeners and liked by his colleagues. But yeah, it just doesn't feel like a fit for how politics really are working in 2025. But then again, if everybody clears out and he's crowned by the institution, the Republican Party just gives him all the money and resources, and there's not much of a primary, he probably just wins. I mean, Tommy Tuberville just got into Congress much the same way. It's not exactly difficult in a state like that. But the bigger question, I mentioned Jay Feely running. Like, that's not the best example because Jay Feely's not any sort of media star. He was the special teams analyst for CBS. But, we've talked about Stephen A. teasing about the presidency. It popped up again last week with Bill Maher for whatever reason, putting his name behind Stephen A. Smith for an election that is not anywhere in the near future. And just broadly, I think, like Drew and I talked about Michael Wilbon teeing off on Bruce Pearl. Obviously, the Jimmy Kimmel suspension drew a bunch of commentary in the sports world. We're here. We're back to sports media intersecting with politics. It's kind of unfortunate that it took like murder and free speech problems to get there, but here we are. Mm-hmm. And you can take it whatever direction you've been thinking about it. But to me, what was kind of surprising is it feels like sports is kind of a place where the average person, this whole Finebaum thing, for instance, was picked up because of polling. I think AJ McCarron's name came up as a candidate as well, right? Sports seems to still be this place where not only we rally around, we all, put our political opinions aside and watch some football, but also like that seems to kind of extend beyond Sundays, Saturdays, whatever. And like these people seem to have a trust and a respect from the average person in a way that I feel like you read articles or surveys or whatever, talk to your buddies about any other walk of life, and it feels like the opposite. No one would want, even the most diehard liberal would not really want an MSNBC host to run for office, I don't think. I don't think some New York Times writer is going to go be this political superhero. People don't like that stuff right now. And yet in sports, it kind of feels like it's not only accepted, but kind of being rooted for with a lot of these examples we're talking about of people directly running for office or just sort of having that, that audience for their political thoughts in a surprising way to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, here in Ohio, it came out last week, Jim Tressel is not going to run for governor. And that was like a big thing that was kind of hanging out there. Is Jim Tressel's actually currently our lieutenant governor. And there was this thought that maybe he could run and primary Vivek Ramaswamy. But once Vivek got Donald Trump's endorsement, like it was kind of a open and shut case. That was actually going to be one of the most interesting things that I think could have ever happened in like Ohio politics is you have a legendary Ohio State football coach running against a Trump endorsed candidate. Like how would that shake out in Ohio? I truly don't know. But it's like, would have been the best test of like Ohio's loyalty to Donald Trump you could have possibly had. I mean, with all of this, my mind has kind of just gone to like, how crazy it, like the place that sports occupies in society, and especially with the Jimmy Kimmel story and the fact that sports played a big role in that story on multiple fronts. On the one hand, you had the idea that Disney needs to stay on good terms with Donald Trump to get the NFL deal approved through the regulatory process. And then you had the idea of the ABC affiliates at Nexstar and Sinclair not putting Jimmy Kimmel back on, and something that Drew Lerner wrote for us, the possibility that ABC could then use its NFL offerings like as leverage in those negotiations. That's where my mind has gone with a lot of this, is just like how kind of nuts it is. And I guess you could say the same about the idea of sports figures like Paul Finebaum, potentially Bruce Pearl, Charles Barkley's always been mentioned. Like the fact that sports fandom is enough to propel somebody to candidacy. It's pretty wild to think about.
Yeah, you mentioned Barkley, and like I think it's good to remember that it's not like the past 5 years are the only time that sports, popular, beloved local sports people have gone on to be super involved politically. Like I don't want to make it sound like it's a new phenomenon. I guess the part that I'm highlighting is that it kind of runs counter to like, not to be so dark about it, but like a lot of stuff that you would have called beloved before doesn't feel as beloved, period. Like people are just frustrated with the status quo and institutions and blah, 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 that it kind of surprises me. But I think the point that you're making is maybe another angle or even a better explanation for what I'm saying, which is sports in general are just so much bigger and more popular and more all-encompassing, even than that probably, I would say, than they ever have been. And so it's just mainstream and like in your face, even for a person who might not even listen to the Paul Finebaum show, for instance, than it would have been before, when I would say sports were something you did as a hobby, something you know that you either were or weren't participating in. Now, Stephen A. Smith's a household name, for better or worse, right? And that's why we kind of bought that he could get involved politically, for instance. So that's probably true. That's probably a big part of this, is the money behind sports, the reliance from these big networks and tech platforms to shove sports in everybody's faces all the time to make money. Like, all of that is contributing to why a Paul Finebaum could go from some guy who just talked about SEC football to, like, I'm going to vote for this person to represent me in the federal government. Like, I mean, you know, that's probably a big part of it.
What do you think about this idea? Because I've seen this written about a few times from different outlets. The idea that Donald Trump is like our most sports friendly president, that he's the president who has leaned into sports the most.
I think that's probably true, but I think he's the most like media and entertainment oriented president. So you could say the same thing about, like, what movie were we just watching last night that Donald Trump was in? Man,
Home Alone 2.
Not Home Alone 2. No, it was my wife and I watched something, and I'm blanking on it, but it was like, I didn't even know, but it was just it was Zoolander. We just threw it on while we were like getting ready to go to sleep and just whatever. And he's in it in a montage at the beginning, like fake commenting on Ben Stiller's character as like the pageant guy, Donald Trump, you know, the Miss Universe guy. And it's just like, I literally looked over at her. I'm like, I don't know what people are going to think in 50 years about the way that he just is in these things and also ran the country, you know, obviously old news, but so I don't know if it's sports. I think it's just kind of like he's just everywhere in that way. But I definitely don't think that a different person, even with his exact same politics and personality, who didn't come up in that world, would have thrown their support behind the Kerry Lakes and the Herschel Walkers and the Tommy Tubervilles of the world. That definitely would not have happened, because I don't think other people would have taken it as seriously as he does.
Yeah, I felt like every president has had like kind of their sports moments. Like Obama did a lot of stuff with the NBA, and he would always do his March Madness picks with ESPN. You know, George Bush, obviously very connected to baseball, to the point that a lot of people wanted him to be commissioner. It feels like Trump is what was previously the owner of the Texas Rangers. I think with Trump, he's the first one to like play up the like the fandom aspect of it. Like, even just like watching him walk out with Bryson on Friday and like lean into the theatrics of it was really just kind of this like surreal moment of like the president of the United States is walking out with like one of our biggest golf stars in like what amounts to like a WWE style entrance at the Ryder Cup, or the way he gets his own walkout at UFC. And the way he favors UFC compared to others.
Well, yeah, I mean, the UFC thing is its whole other part of this, with the White House card that's being planned and heavily publicized. But yeah, I mean, I had always thought, like, you know, you and I had just, even during the election last year and then on through his victory, talked about how there just wasn't the same level of energy behind it. And this is a bigger than just a sports media story. There just hasn't really been that kind of resistance, backlash, whatever you want to call it, that really came about. Maybe it's happening now. Maybe that's just part of why sports media inevitably was going to get sucked into whatever the way that the tides turn. But I always thought that no matter whatever might happen in 2025, next year, the World Cup is going to be here. And like, if you don't think that Trump is going to take every opportunity to milk that the same way that he already has with the Ryder Cup or the Super Bowl or the whatever that you want to point to, didn't he go to a gymnastics final? Like,
that sounds right. Yeah.
Recently, like, the World Cup was bound to bring. I mean, it's a geopolitical event. Like that's the kind of the whole thing of it, and so that next year is going to be pretty fascinating to see. The way that he's received by other countries and the way that our media and sports figures kind of respond to it. Because, from anyone participating is going to be asked about it. It's going to be a story. He's going to make it a story, and it's going to collide these worlds even more.
Well, it's already started too with him floating that, cities that he deems unsafe shouldn't be hosting these events. Like you're already seeing it getting used as a pawn in some of these, political conversations. And so that's just like, those are things like, just like as a sports fan, like you never thought about like back in, 2012, 2013.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, where we're coming to, where we're connecting the Finebaum thing to this second portion of our conversation is kind of like he's right to pick up on the invasiveness and importance of sports and like make something out of it, right? I mean, I don't necessarily love where what you just said about the World Cup is headed, personally, but like,
yeah,
I think it had a lot to do with why Obama was seen as approachable and relatable, right? To a certain segment of people who might like the NBA or like basketball or, just want that. And probably the same with Bush and baseball. Like, but Trump has just seized on it in a way and formed direct relationships with athletes, I think, in a way that's unique. And it probably does help him. I mean, you could use the word sports washing or whatever. We don't usually use that about our own country, but maybe it works here, right? Like, yeah. I think that's definitely, it's going a long way. And I think that the Finebaum types who have picked up on it are kind of riding the same wins, just in a little bit of a different way.
Taking this back to Finebaum real quick before we move on, if he doesn't run, or in this weird time between him deciding to run and not run, like, is it just going to be business as usual? Like he's on ESPN and meanwhile this is hanging out there that like he's considering running, like just up and leaving and running for governor and doing so like in a very pro Donald Trump man. Like, it's going to be weird to see him on Get Up on Thursday.
I suppose so, but I think it kind of goes back to what this is just my opinion. I don't know what ESPN thinks, of course, but I think it's similar to Stephen A in a way where he's been a company man and earned the respect long enough in that building that as long as he doesn't cross a line, and I think he is very aware of where that line is, then especially like it's what, a couple months, like,
yeah, I think he said a month and a half.
Yeah. So then, and then once if he were to run, I would imagine he would step down from the show and just campaign full time, and that'll be that. So I think I think both sides are mature enough to ride it out. It's better than Stephen A making the next 4 years about himself and his political future,
Yeah. No, I think he's built a certain level of, I guess, for lack of a better term, like credibility. Like, I think people are willing to separate that from his football analysis and his football personality. And I also think this being, like we've said, like Trump 2.0, like the fact that it's just like more widely accepted as a mainstream political, like the most mainstream political belief in this country, based on the election results, like that. I think that like it's a lot different than had this been in 2020, obviously.
Yeah. Or even before that, frankly, I think that would have been like, don't watch his show,
right,
mobilization type of thing on the left if this had happened previously. But I think too, like we said, because it's not coming across as a grift. So I think people are just sort of like, all right, that's what Paul's choosing to do. He's an older guy and let him do it. What else really is there to say?